Monday, I have rheumatoid arthritis.
Monday morning differential diagnosis.
Even when they do come in and tell you that, still go through the format, still go through the intake, still look at all of our criteria. Because that diagnosis should not become your criteria for what your intervention needs to be. Okay? As we have seen, there are multiple other things that are also associated with these conditions that can sometimes tell us otherwise. So for this morning session, this is what we're going to talk about. And after our break, then we're going to do some case studies. So I have 3 cases. You guys are going to break up into groups. And they're going to give you some time to look through the case and discuss it. And then on the last page, you guys have to make the diagnosis and also plan what your intervention will be. Okay? So hopefully you'll get a little bit of an exercise as to how to understand the difference between the conditions. And good thing, you'll be in a group so you can discuss. You have all your notes, you can look through and pick and choose how you want it. What would be your approach to this condition? Okay? Sound good? Okay. Is this off? Yeah. Okay. So in looking at the typical signs and symptoms that we find in these conditions. Oh, actually, yeah. Just a tiny little bit. Maybe, can we like make it?
Yeah, I think you can focus up.
Focus up? Exactly.
The other way.
As in the turning of the
Ask it to inhale.
Oh, there we go. There you go.
Okay,
Yeah.
now move.
Sitting there, other
Just
way.
turn it.
So now
Yeah.
turn, you want to turn. There
Perfect.
you go.
Thank you.
Lovely.
2 heads are better than 1.
Teacher assistant.
Okay. So looking at these are just some of the common signs and symptoms that you find. Of course, there are more than these, but these are certain things that you're going to find in all 3 of these conditions, and how do you tell the difference between them? Okay, so the first is tenderness. Tenderness means when you touch it, it hurts. It usually, an easy way to find out if someone has tenderness is if you go to touch it, they immediately draw back. They don't want you to touch it. Sometimes even before you touch it, you already start to feel the pain. That indicates the severity of the tenderness. Okay, so tenderness is a typical sign and symptom. Of course, in Vata Rakta, regardless of the type of Vata Rakta, in comparison to the other 2, this is much more severe, much more significant. So the tenderness tends to be much more. It can be, and depending on the type of Vata Rakta, it can be either moderate or very severe. And severe really, to this range, indicates more of the Pittaja and then the Raktaja. The Raktaja is the most tender. And usually in the Raktaja type, remember the drawing that we had, the joint tends to be really swollen, and it's there's a lot of stagnant blood. It's very red. There's heat exuding from that, and when you touch it, it is very, very painful. Okay, and that's because there is the accumulation of both Rakta and Vata there. Vata stuck there too, so it becomes very painful. Okay? And Amavata tends to be moderate, so there is pain, but it's not, or there is tenderness, but it's not necessarily as much in comparison to Vata. And in Sandhigata Vata, there isn't really tenderness. So the symptom of pain on touch isn't really there as much in Sandhigata Vata. So in just this particular type of symptom where you're testing, you're doing Sparshana to figure out what exactly they have, In Vata Rakta, it's very severe. In Amavata, it's somewhat moderate. It needs more pressure before they will feel the pain. Whereas in Sandhigata Vata, that sort of symptom isn't as significant. Okay? Pain. Now, of course, in all of these conditions, there'll be pain. The one thing that they come and say is they have pain in their joints. Okay? So that's a common symptom you're going to find in all of these conditions. Now, in Vata Rakta, the pain tends to be moderate to severe, and it tends to be more pronounced in the morning. They tend to have stiffness and more amount of pain in the morning time for Vata Rakta. Because of the fact that there's less circulation at nighttime, so it just builds upon the already blocked circulation. Remember we talked about Vata Rakta being more of sort of a circulatory issue? So since in the nighttime there is less lower circulation, when they wake up in the morning and they do have to start moving, they find that their joints are very stiff, and then it's more painful. Okay? In Amavada also the pain, because of the Ama, they don't necessarily have as much of that Vata type of pain that you will find typically. It kind of helps to somewhat buffer, even though Ama is not the best sort of moisture you want, but it is still some form of yucky moisture. So it does kind of help to buffer out a little bit of that aggravated Vata. So the pain again here in comparison to Vata Rakta, it's not as much. It's somewhere mild to moderate pain. They also have increase of pain in the morning and the evening. In Vata Rakta, it's usually typically more in the morning, and as the day progresses, it helps to loosen up a little bit because they get moving and the circulation starts moving, and it helps to relieve some of the pressure that may be building with that joint. Whereas in Amavada, it increases in the morning and evening at the time where there's more amount of Kleda in the body, which is in the morning time, as well as in the evening time when Vata is rising, because those are the components of this condition. So in the kapha time and in the evening time, that's when you're going to find more amount of pain in Amavada.
When you say about the rising, what time are you
I'd say around, and again, it differs from place to place and season, where, basically when the sun's setting and the external temperature is starting to cool down, then that's kind of like when you're entering into the Vata time.
So not the Vata that we know.
We can't, again, here also, like what we talked about on the first day, we can't keep a fixed time, because in the summertime, when the days are longer, at 6 o'clock really isn't applicable for Vata time, because the sun is still fairly high, it's still really warm, and you haven't it may start to set in a little bit, but there's still a change in how much of Vata will get activated, because the earth itself isn't cooling down so quickly. So that variation changes from season to season as well. Am I confusing you guys? No.
You say it again.
Okay, yeah, I know, I'm like, okay, get it. In the season, this is good because if we look at, the length of the day and when the sun is there, and then when there's the moon cycle or when it's cooler, that's how you're going to split it up. So in the summertime, this is greater and this is less, right? So according to when the sun is there, that's how you can split up.
Thank you.
The time.
Let there be light.
In the summertime, the daytime itself is more and the nighttime is less. So you have this much time to kind of split up for the dosha. Whereas in the nighttime, you see if you're looking at it as this is time, the time period for Kapha, Pitta, and Vata will be longer in summertime when the days are longer, and the time in the night will be a little bit shorter. And it's the opposite for the winter, where the daytime is less and the nighttime is more. So that, sorry, it didn't do that before, but you get the point. Okay.
So does that imply that the sort of the difference in the functioning of the doshas and their AM and PM, that those, during the seasons, those functions are more or less prevalent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's, if we really break it down to this, then we can understand why they say that these doshas are predominant in that season. So if we look at it from this very basic aspect, then you can adjust it according to where you live. And you're not sticking to everybody in the Western Hemisphere or everybody in North America. They're going to have aggravated vata from 6 to 10 p.m. You know, it's not necessarily the case because Florida is very different, California is very different, Washington is very different, Maine is very different, Massachusetts is very different. If there's a drastic change from Maine to Massachusetts, we're on the same coast, we're just a couple hours away. From Montreal to here. We're still on the same side, but there's a drastic difference between the hours of daylight and how the environment is reacting to that. Because the whole point of looking at the doshas and predominance of time in relation to the environment, time in relation to actual time. Time is determined by sunlight and nighttime, right? That's the actual look at, you know, in the olden days, how they had these solar clocks. Yes, the sundial. So that way of looking at time was actually more precise in looking at the effect on doshas than now our rigid, segmented time that we have. So if we look at it in that sense, then it's much easier actually to understand the concept of how the doshas are rising and falling according to time of day and time of night. Okay. Yes. It's the same way we can now start to adjust our understanding of predominance of dosha according to stage of life, because back in those days, people used to live a minimum of 100 years, whereas now it's definitely not 100 years. So if we're not living around 100 years, our lifespan itself, our life expectancy has reduced to somewhere around, give or 80 years, give or take, plus or minus around 5 to 10 years. Then according to that, then we can divide our lifespan up into the doshas, predominance. As opposed to back in those days, it was 100 years. So they divided it differently. Okay? So that's kind of how we can look at it according to what's applicable to where we live and what time period or what age we're in. Age in the sense of it's coming and go, or it's the end of coming and go. And it gets a little bit. Okay. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So depending on the season and depending on how, looking at the external factors, because what this is indicating is how external factors is influencing the rise of the doshas in this condition. Okay, so just like we were talking about, there's a kriya kala for a healthy person and kriya kala according to season of looking at the doshas. There's a kriya kala for disease, and also there also you can look at the rise and fall of doshas according to the time of day as well. Okay, so in Amavada they tend to have more amount of pain in the morning and in the evening. Usually during the midday when the sun is higher, it tends to help to relieve some of the pain, because it helps to relieve some of the stagnation of ama, as well as the heat itself tends to relieve some of the pain of vata. Okay, so that's why during the midday they tend to not feel so bad. So in Sandhigata vata, the pain can be moderate to severe depending on the chronicity. So if the vata is very aggravated and this has been a long-standing condition, then the pain starts to get worse and worse and worse. So, and this also indicates, remember we were talking about that those destructive changes in Sandhigata vata, it starts to first dry out the Shleshika kapha, and then it starts to deplete the surrounding structures. It starts to affect the muscle, it starts to affect the cartilage and the bone. So depending on how chronic or how much of it is actually starting to dry out, then we can determine how severe the pain would be. Because even if we look at what Gerard was explaining, the more it dries out, the more it starts to fuse together. And the more it's fusing, of course, it's going to be very difficult to have flexion of that joint, and it's going to obviously be painful. A nice little trick that we do in Ayurveda when we do examination of a patient, especially for Sandhigata Vata, is you ever see them doing this where they're checking in between the joints? Okay, why don't you all do this? Put your fingers right by your knuckles, and if you press down right at your knuckles right here, you should feel a gap between the upper bone and the lower one. You feel a little gap?
Yes.
You feel a very clear gap,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
That's a healthy, normal gap. That's kind of indicated that there's enough space, that this is a synovial joint, and there's enough space between the two bones that you can actually feel the ends of the bones, right? So there is a gap between them, and that's what you're feeling is this space right here between these two. So it goes down like this, and it's what you're feeling. What you're feeling here, you're pressing down right here. That's what you're feeling. Okay? So as Sandhigata Vata starts to develop, this starts to dry out and these move closer together. So that gap starts to become less and less. So it's a nice little trick to figure out and see how much it is progressing. And an easy way to find it out is, depending on where they have the pain, you do that with the joint. The same thing you can feel in the knee as well. If you palpate it, you can start to feel a little bit. Of course, I'm standing, so I can't. Yeah. But when you flex the joint and you palpate around it, you can start to feel. You can run your fingers on down the side and start to feel a little bit of the side of the bone. Do you guys feel it?
Yep.
And if you move the patella a little bit, you feel it even more. It's even more clear. So whichever joint that they describe that they're having pain, you want to palpate and see, look for that gap. And the more severe it is, the more that gap, the gap is much less, it's decreased. And also you even may, and the more practice you do, you'll even, if there are bone spurs, you can even start to feel that.
Oh.
So in certain conditions of Sandhigata Vata, if the person is a very aggravated Vata and you feel this, even in the smaller joints, even if this is not the place where they have pain, but what I like to do is when I go to check pulse, the first thing I'll do is I'll check their nails, I'll check this, and then I'll check their pulse. And so when you check for this, if there is any calcification, you can usually start to feel it. And then if you feel like it's feeling a little bit stiff or there isn't that enough of a gap, then you just have them flex it. And if it is starting to dry out and there is this formation starting, when you flex it, you'll feel the grittiness. You'll actually be able to feel the grittiness. None of us have it because you all do yoga, so therefore you most likely will not have it. Okay? But for other people, they will have this sort of reaction. Okay, so it's a nice little trick for you to do when you see your clients. Just check for that. Okay, so that's the pain factor. So the more severe the condition, the more chronic the condition, the more severe the pain. Okay? So that's what you get in Sandhigata Vata. Next is swelling. So swelling is again present in all of them. In swelling of Vata Rakta, it can be a significant swelling. It tends to be more of a pitting edema, which means, remember we talked about if you press down on the swelling, it tends to leave like a little bit of an indent, that you find more of that in Vata Rakta. In Amavata, you can also find that as well. But the difference is, here also the swelling can be intermittent. It can come and go. And in this one, it tends to be a little bit more stagnant. Here, the swelling, you can move it, it's mobile. For instance, you're palpating, and the swelling is there, but you can still move things around. Whereas in Amavata, when there is a swelling and you're palpating and trying to move, it's more stiff. Remember when we were talking about Amavata, one of the cardinal symptoms of looking at that is it creates stiffness because of the hardening of Ama and Vata. So in this type, the swelling will be there, but it tends to be more of a stiff, stagnant swelling as opposed to a moving swelling. Okay? And in Sandhigata Vata, there'll be maybe mild to none. It's more of like an air type of swelling where it's Vata getting stuck. So those of you, anybody crack their knuckles? Okay. So you know how if you don't crack your knuckles, it almost feels like it's swollen. There's something bothering you, so you want to crack it to get it out. That's exactly like a very, very tiny version of Sandhigata Vata. Because what it is it's Vata that is getting stuck in your joints, in your knuckles. So when you crack it, that sound that is produced is nothing but Vata moving out of that place where it was stuck. So in Sandhigata Vata, it's of course a much more severe version of that same thing. So in those, that's why in Sandhigata Vata, you do tend to find a lot of that sound, that crepitus. And it's not just the regular little sound that you get from cracking your knuckles, but what you do find is their sounds, it sounds very similar to that, but it's sometimes louder. Sometimes what happens is when there is more of a trapping of Vata in that joint, if it's in larger joints, when they move it, you'll be able to feel it. So depending on the severity there also, the best thing to do is put your hand over the joint and then flex. And check to see the crepitus, okay? So you put your hand over the joint and flex. If the person has crepitus, if it's mild, you won't be able to hear it, but you can feel it. The more severe it gets, the more prominent it becomes. The more chronic it is, crepitus is the sound that's created. Very similar to that of like cracking your knuckles. But the difference is, in larger joints like the knee, it tends to first, if you're cracking it, it produces that sound or that feeling. You can only feel it, you can't hear it. The more severe it becomes, the more louder it becomes. And then there are some people who are just walking and you hear them going crick, 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 crick. That's because they do. That's a typical way to find out if somebody has Sandhigata Vata without them even knowing.
What?
Yeah. So it'll make that sound. Also, another reason to put your hand over the joint and flex is because if these bone spurs are starting to form, you feel the gritty, sandy kind of feeling. You also feel that as the Vata starts to move out and create the sound, it also feels kind of crackly, almost like there's sand in between that. You'll actually be able to feel it because it's the crystallization, it's the drawing out of the Kleshika Kapha. So as the Vata moves, you can feel the sort of hindrance of that movement. And it feels kind of gritty. Okay? So these are nice little tricks for you to figure out.
I'm here.
So that's what you get with the type of swelling in Sandhigata Vata. In Sandhigata Vata also, you may find that the swelling. So you'll find that the swelling also, if you're looking at the history in Sandhigata Vata, you may find that the swelling moves from place to place. Because, for instance, if Vata is such a thing that it'll look for the place where there's more space and where it can get to that place and start to aggravate even more. So what happens is sometimes if it starts in maybe a smaller joint or it starts in a larger joint, if you do certain things, or you apply a little bit of oil, or you do a little bit of yoga, you go get a massage, it kind of subsides a little bit. But the underlying aggravation of Vata, the causative factors for aggravated Vata is still there. You haven't done anything to really get rid of that much of aggravation of Vata. So it'll stay latent, and the minute, like either in the evening time, or you go out and it's cold, or you went for a ride and you left the window open and the breeze is in your face, it again those act all as trigger factors. Vata aggravates again, and it may settle in another place. So you may find that they'll say, you know, it's so weird. Like sometimes I feel kind of crackly on my knees. Sometimes it's my back. Sometimes it's my shoulder. It's never like one place, but I feel really kind of prickly, crackly. Or I feel like there's some, I'm popping and cracking all over the place. So that's something you kind of find common with Sandhi Vata. Okay, so that's about the swelling. The temperature. This is another key one in the signs and symptoms of all of these conditions. Again, of course, because of the Rakta component in this condition, Vata Rakta, the joints always tend to be warm or hot. With the exception of the Vataja type or the Kaphaja type, it's a little bit cooler, but it's still, if you were to feel the temperature of the joint from there to the other parts of the body, it still will be slightly warmer in comparison. Okay? So one common factor that you find in all types of Vata Rakta, it can be anywhere from warm to hot. And usually, even if you don't feel it externally, but they will explain and say that they feel a burning sensation. So even upon palpation, if you're not feeling it, but you ask them, do you feel like your joints are burning or you feel there's heat? They usually will say that. Even if you don't ask them, they'll say, I feel like there's heat coming out of my joints. Have you guys heard people say that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of what you do find with Vata Rakta. It does feel warm and hot. There's a burning sensation in the affected joints. Now in Ama Vata, you do also get this. You can also get that sort of heat and burning sensation in Ama Vata as well. But that happens when the Ama has started to manifest with a fever. So in Ama Vata, remember, because of the presence of Ama, it can almost always be associated with a fever. Remember the signs and symptoms? We talked about it being with a fever, because Ama is one of the basic factors for the manifestation of fever, right? So it's a lower Agni formation of Ama, and so we end up getting fever. So in Ama Vata, you can also get this sort of hot feeling on the joints. But the main difference of how to tell between an Ama Vata and Vata Rakta is other signs and symptoms. So if this has a swelling, this has a swelling, this one is hot, this one is hot. What you look for is the type of swelling. Is it this one or this one? You look for also the type of pain. You see? So if, for instance, if there are certain signs and symptoms that are the same across the board, then you compare it with the other ones, because those are different. Okay? So that's why it's good to kind of memorize this little checklist. Yeah. So you'll be able to, if you're finding, okay, well, this person came in, so she has pain in her joints and they're warm. So what does that mean? That could still be anything. It could still be, maybe it rules out a little bit of Sandhigata Vata, but it could be either one of these. So we know that Vata Rakta is because of Vata Rakta. So we start asking for these signs and symptoms. We start looking for all the other associated signs and symptoms that we know to be associated with Vata Rakta. If we think that it's Ama Vata, then we start poking around to find very specific signs and symptoms of Ama. Okay, Vata is there in both of these. But the difference between this one and that one is Rakta and Ama. So those are the specific questions that we'll be asking to find out, is there more predominance of Ama in this person, or is there more predominance of aggravated Rakta in this person? And that's what helps you to tell the difference. Okay? Make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Ama will create the fever effect, right? Why wouldn't it do that when it's somewhere else?
Where?
When it's in the stomach.
It does?
It does? It will create fever?
In general.
In general. Okay. Fever, not just fever.
Not just fever. It doesn't, it is kind of like, it is a rise of body temperature. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in the grade of fever as what we would define as fever. But yes, a rise in body temperature. So for instance, people who naturally tend to have a lower body temperature, if there is a change or a rise in that body temperature, that does indicate what we would define as a fever. Basically what happens is, because of the production of Ama, what is described in the classical text is this ama can help to displace the agni into the extremities of the body. If ama is present, that is also one reaction that can happen, where it can cause the agni to be dispersed. So that's why you find that in a person who has a fever or jwara, you find that there is increase of temperature in the extremities, and if you feel their abdomen, it's cold. You ever notice that?
Ama is coldish and slushy. It's moving.
It moves it, it pushes out, it displaces the agni. So when a person has ama, we try to increase the agni over here, and that'll automatically draw the heat back into where it needs to be. So that's why it relieves the heat from this part of the body, but the heat rises up. You ever notice if you look at all of the typical remedies for fever, all the olden traditional remedies, they have chicken soup. Why does chicken soup work? Chicken soup isn't actually an ideal, even a very Ayurvedic concept. If we look at the concept of it or how it works, it goes along with the Ayurvedic aspect of why chicken soup would work for fever. Because chicken is very ushna in ushna vidya. So it helps to actually enhance the agni. Also, because it is cooked as soup, and it's not just saute some chicken or roast chicken or grilled chicken and eat it. Because it's cooked as a soup, it's cooked down a lot, so it actually makes it easier to digest. So chicken soup is mamsa rasa. It is a meat soup. And mamsa rasa is one of the methods to actually increase your agni. Have you heard of these different Peyadikramas or the different regimen that they usually advise for after doing a cleanse or after doing Shodhana? I shouldn't say cleanse. After doing Shodhana, they typically ask you to do this particular type of diet. And here we tend to more concentrate on the vegetarian aspect. But classically, they haven't necessarily kept it only vegetarian. In fact, it goes peya, which is a rice gruel, a bilepi, which is more like khichdi, it's a thicker rice gruel. For the yusha is sort of like mung bean soup. So in that, you have it with spices. Then from there, it goes to krita mamsa rasa. And krita mamsa rasa means spices in a meat soup. Okay? And then from there, it goes into food. That is the actual order of things of how you slowly increase in the quality of food to increase the agni and to provide easy to digest but nourishing food. Okay? So mamsa rasa is one of the methods for increasing agni and providing nutrition. So chicken soup is a good idea for you to have when you have a fever. And instinctively, people do this. Okay?
And Michelle, when you talk about fever, is it a long-standing, or would it also be reflective of like a hot flash?
It's a hot flash is slightly different. A hot flash, it has a slightly different pathogen.
Yeah.
And for that also it depends on the cause. So it's not exactly considered as a fever. It's more, it depends. Sometimes it could be an aggravation of pitta, sometimes it could be because of fire, sometimes agni, displaced agni, sometimes it could be because of something that is blocking the flow of pitta in the body, and that's why it's exhibiting that. So it can be multiple things. Okay. Okay. So the next is temperature. You find that there's always more warm to hot in Vata Rakta. This sometimes can be warm when it's associated with fever, and sometimes when there's a lack of fever, then it'll be cold. Okay, so if there isn't a fever, then the swelling or the pain on the joint, there will be cold. So it can be warm and it can be cold. Okay, and what you want to look for is the other signs of the fever, the presence of fever or the lack thereof. In Sambhigata Vada, it's almost always cold. because it's just Vata alone. So in this condition, it tends to always be cold. And also cold, not just it feels cold, but if you check the temperature of that joint compared to the other part of the body, the joint is colder in comparison to the other part of the body. Okay? So in Sandhigata Vata, that's a fairly easy one that we know. Okay? Crepitus. Crepitus is that sound that we were talking about. So in Vata Rakta, it tends to produce a mild to moderate sound. It's not really very significant in Vata Rakta. If it is in a very, very chronic stage of Vata Rakta, where the structures have become destroyed and they're starting to melt together, then maybe. But for the most part, in most conditions of Vata Rakta, the crepitus doesn't tend to be very significant. It's mild to moderate, maybe. And Amavata also, remember I told you Ama though being sticky and sludgy, but it is some kind of moisture. So there you won't find as much crepitus. Like for instance, when you do this, there may be one pop and then it's done, or two pops and then it's done. But in the difference in both of these is in Sandhigata Vata, it's very significant. Every time you flex it, every time it produces a sound. You keep doing it. You notice like if you crack your knuckles, you do it and it makes a sound. 2 or 3 times after that, it doesn't make any more. So that means all of it is gone. It's moved out. There's nothing more to create that sound, right? So in Vata Rakta and Amavata, it's kind of that. If there is Vata involved there. But when you do it once or you do it twice, then after that, it kind of displaces. There's no more really to make that sound. Whereas in Sandhigata Vata, there's a lot. It's consistently there. Every time you move it, every time it will make sound. And you'll get, the more you make it, the more you'll be able to even feel that grittiness, if there's that grittiness forming. Okay? So crepitus is very significant in Sandhigata Vata. The color of the affected area. So remember in all of these, we also talked about discoloration of the skin and different sorts of colors that you will find.
Yeah.
So in Vata Rakta, of course, again, because of the involvement of Rakta, it tends to be more pinkish or red. There is that sort of, not really increased vascularity, but it's because of the stagnant blood, the accumulation of Rakta there, that does tend to turn it more to the sort of reddish hue. So whatever your skin tone or skin color may be, it'll be a sort of a pinky reddish version of that, okay? So that's kind of what you want to look for. And the more chronic it becomes, the more swelling there is, the more red it becomes, okay? In Amavata, it looks more dull and opaque because of the presence of Ama. So it looks just like Ama skin, you know? It looks kind of dull, a little bit, not really shiny, oily, but like oil that has been dried up and looks really yucky. So that's kind of what the joint looks like, and even their face kind of looks like that. You'll find that sort of distributed around in the whole body, but it's even more significant in the place where you find the joint pain, okay? And in Sandhigata Vata, there's usually more of a darkening or a blackish brown discoloration. Because whenever Vata alone is involved, Vata tends to dry out the tissues. And you ever notice, like when you, if your skin is really dry, or if your skin is not getting enough moisture, it tends to start to turn darker than the regular color, and then it gets darker and darker and darker. So it almost looks like it's dried and shriveled. And dried and shriveled is almost more in a much darker tone than what the other healthy skin looks like. One of my teachers used to call this lizard-like skin. That's exactly, he was the same one who used to advise Gandharva study all the time.
Oh.
And I just find it so ironic that I'm always repeating this word.
It's like freckly too in the area.
Yeah, and it really does. It starts to dry out. You ever seen some people like they moisturize a lot and they keep putting lotion and all of that, and the rest of their skin looks nice and healthy, and you look at their knuckles and it's dark.
Oh yeah.
And their knuckles are really, really dark, and they look like you haven't put anything on it for like days.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of their skin looks healthy, but the knuckles look dark. That's another little tidbit, another thing to look for. So
Elbows too.
elbows too.
Yeah.
And it's basically the area where Vata is sitting and aggravating. Vata gets stuck there and it's moving, and it just, because it can't sit one place, so it has one small little confined area, so it sits there and it moves there. And the more faster it moves there, the more dries out the natural nourishment that's there. And since it's not moving, it's not allowing good, healthy, new nourishment to get there. So it just uses up what's there, and that's why it looks so dry and unhealthy. And all the rest of the skin is fine, but that place where it's stuck is dry. And they can keep applying. Sometimes I ask my clients, so do you have dry skin? They're like, well, I don't know, but I do tend to put like, I try to moisturize a lot. So it's like, how often do you moisturize? Well, I like to put cream on like every 2 hours. So I don't really know if I have dry skin, but I put it on every 2 hours. I'm like, okay then. So you do get that too.
Yeah.
But even if they moisturize every 2 hours, those particular signs and symptoms don't subside with dysfunction. It'll still be there.
In the brownness, like when I asked the other day about, I've had clients whose entire lower leg was brown, very dark brown. And it wasn't the joint, so it was obviously the circulation issue that dried out the tissue. Can they regain the color, or is that, they can't? Even in the joints and things.
Yes. If it hasn't gotten to the stage where this is all that is stuck together and everything is completely dried out and the Osteo itself has depleted so much that they're fused together, if it hasn't gotten to there, then yes, it absolutely can. But if it fuses together, then it's in something of the Vata. If it gets to that stage, then it's very far gone and it's hard for us to be able to get it back up.
I'm just curious with your client how old they are. I see this all the time, and 60s, 70s, 80s, once they do it in their 80s, I'm surprised sometimes. It may recede somewhat, but it might take 2 or 3 years.
It all depends on what sort of intervention you're doing. If you're doing a mild intervention, then it will take a long time. If you're doing a more aggressive intervention, then it will take less time. If you're doing a very, very aggressive intervention specific to that condition, then it'll take very little time. But in the aggressive intervention, because it's aggressive, it will make the whole body feel weak for a little bit of time. And then you're basically, you're bringing it down to baseline. You're taking out everything and then you're building back from there. So in the very aggressive approach, it is aggressive, but it's faster because it's aggressive. But it takes out everything. So you don't feel good with that method. Otherwise, you go for the moderate method where it's not aggressive, but it's not very mild. It'll take less time than the very mild method, but it may produce some discomfort in the beginning, and then they will start to feel better because it's getting things moving up. If you go the very mild method, it moves a little bit at a time, day by day, so it's not strong enough to produce a discomfort. It's still working, but it's going to take very long.
And even in extreme elderly, like with people with brown leg syndrome, whatever you want to call it.
Like 40s
Oh, wow.
and obese.
Because I ask them oftentimes too, men or women, because they usually don't have hair on their lower leg either. That's it. Did you at one time in your life have hair on your lower leg? And I go, oh yeah. So there's a circulatory issue, and
Yes, but after a certain age, the dhatus themselves start to. You remember Gerard had this graph of when it naturally starts to deplete, and then the regular natural decline of the quality of tissues, and that is expected. There is a natural kind of decline that you find.
Oh, she's right over there.
There is a natural decline in the quality of the dhatu. So remember, hair on your body is a byproduct of dhatu parinama, of natural healthy formation of dhatu. So that can happen in like later years in your life that you won't have as much hair on your body. That's kind of expected. But as long as the dhatus are still fairly healthy and they're functioning, that's sort of a normal, a prakrita vikriti. Whereas opposed to when it's in this age, and 40 years old, and there's a lot of other associated symptoms, then it is a vikrita vikriti. Okay? Okie dokie. So we have the color of the affected area. Here it's dull. There is a darkish brown color. Abnormality in structure. So this is kind of looking at when it starts to get chronic. How do we tell the difference between these chronic conditions? In Vata Rakta, remember, Gerard showed you that there's the fanning out and then the swan kind of formation of the hands, which is basically, again, what happens is the Rakta gets stuck. There is no circulation or any nourishment that is reaching there. So what happens is there's complete depletion of those tissues, all of the tissues. So that includes then the skin, the muscles, the tendons, the joints, the bones, everything is depleted because there is absolutely no nutrition, no circulation happening there. So it starts to, what happens when there's no nutrition at all? It starts to dry out. It uses up whatever nutrition was there, and when there's nothing left, it dries out, and then it curves. Right? Remember, it constricts, it curves. So that's kind of what happens in the chronic stages of Vata Rakta.
So that's like, is it depressing? When people just attend and go to the
future.
When it's contracting this way.
Yeah.
You notice that even in the Vata Vyadis, also, if you go back and read now the Vata Vyadis, these all same symptoms are described, but in that area where it is manifesting. So there also, even in if it is Vata Vyadi in the whole body starts to do this. So you find that, and it's not just with the spine, but you find the other joints and the other parts of the body that prior to that was flexible, they all start to sort of move inward. They're drying up, they're constricting, they're literally shriveling up.
Yeah, like in this case, it's like knots. You get like, the person will get knots in her tendons
And it's shriveled.
pretty much stuck.
Yeah, and yeah, it looks like a tennis ball, like a claw.
Yeah.
Like that's the, I forgot the name of that. There's a name for it where it is described. It means that the hand looks like a claw. Yeah, and that is again that is when Vata gets stuck in the snayu. And that's one we'll describe that one in one of the webinars. Because we have that's basically like carpal tunnel. And another issue where instead of looking at it in the sandhi and the asti, it is in the snayu or in the tendons. So Vata getting stuck over there, so that's why it's stuck. But we'll talk more about that one. Okay, so we have deformity in chronic conditions. In Amavada, typically it's more of that sort of swelling. The more chronic it becomes, at that point you do get a larger swelling. But what you do, it's not deformed, it just becomes really stiff. Really, really, really stiff and really immobile. So that happens in chronic conditions of Amavada. In Sandhigata Vada, it looks again depleted and it may move inwards. But the difference between this one and that one, this happens at a much more accelerated rate than even Sandhigata Vada. Okay? Because here you have two components that are working against the person in this condition, whereas in Sandhigata Vata it's one. Vata does tend to be really strong and it can cause a problem, but it may also, since it's one dosha, it can fluctuate due to these other environmental factors, like time of day, season, and other daily routines. It can help to fluctuate and maybe reduce it a little bit here and there. But in this one, this tends to be, it finds a place, it gets stuck there, and then if you don't do anything to remove that block or to enhance that circulation or get things moving again, it'll sit there, get stuck there, and it just festers and grows and grows and grows. So the deformity can happen much faster at an accelerated rate in Vata Rakta in comparison to Sandhigata Vata. Both have deformity. Both deformity is quite similar, but here what you're also going to find in Sandhigata Vata, it won't just happen in that joint, it'll start to happen throughout the whole body. Whereas here, it'll happen only in the joint. Okay? So again, the difference between Vata Rakta and Sandhigata Vata
And bunions are still separate from this.
Yes, and we will talk about
Yeah,
that.
okay.
Yeah. Movement and flexibility. Of course, another very important, the whole point of joints, that's their function, is to move. Okay? So in Vata Rakta, when you move those joints, they're quite painful again. Because remember, it's It's Vata and Rakta, the circulation. So when the Rakta gets stuck there, it doesn't allow, it's a physical block, not allowing for easy movement. Okay, so when you do flex the joints, it does tend to be quite painful. In chronic conditions, again, in chronic conditions where all of this starts to get destroyed, then there's very, very little flexibility. In Amavada, here instead there isn't such an issue so much with the movement, but more of stiffness. So it's not necessarily painful on movement, but it just feels like you can't move it. It feels stiff, okay? And sometimes it won't necessarily only be in the joints, it can be in the whole body. Because remember when we looked at Amavada, it is a systemic disease. So you won't just find stiffness only in the joint, you'll find it in the whole body. Because at that point, there's an issue of Ama and Vata in the whole body, not just in the joints. Okay, and in Sandhigata Vada, there's pain on movement with the cracking sound. Okay, and the more chronic it is, the more painful it is. But in comparison, if you were to, for instance, have like a pain scale and ask them from 1 to 10, Vata Rakta always is more on the higher end compared to these other two. Vata Rakta is always more painful. Okay? Okie dokie. So is this clearer or more confusing?
No, it's good, Rachel. It's very good.
You're gonna leave the chart up when we do our thing,
I can, yeah.
Good.
That's just gonna give it away though.
so. But when I think in the moment, it creates an order that's not in there.
Yes, okay, I get that. I'll give you that. Okay, yes. So we will leave
Some
this
of us
up.
are very visual.
Okay, I will give you that. We will leave this chart up when we do the
Or just blur it.
There you go, add a little bit of a challenge in there.
When you would chart, you get clearly cross-reference and say, oh, yeah, this is present and this is not. It just doesn't happen. So to me, it definitely gives me an order that I wouldn't have otherwise because of.
It's a lot, yeah, I understand. So in Vata Rakta, actually both of these conditions do come under this. Now again, this isn't anything different than what's in your notes. This information, all the stuff you can find online. Gerard probably gave you much more than what I put in here because this is all from just the very general description and from the Mayo Clinic website. I like their website because I like how they've organized everything. So I like to read, every now and then from there. Vata Rakta, of course, these are the signs and symptoms which we talked about. You have this twitching sensation, pricking pain, splitting pain, heaviness, and numbness in these regions. In rheumatoid arthritis, you see that they have, again, the tender, warm, swelling, swollen joints, and here they do say it's associated with fatigue, fever, and weight loss. So there may be every now and then a very slight aggravation or maybe a fever, but it's not really very significant in Vata Rakta. But you do get the issue of fatigue and sometimes weight loss in the sense that it is, again, a Vata condition and it is a circulatory problem. Okay, here again, the same sort of issues that in those particular joints, similar what is described for Vata Rakta. You get itching here, and here frequent pain will appear and disappear from the joint suddenly. They haven't really mentioned that too much, but they also mention here that it may affect the skin, lungs, kidney, nerve tissue, blood vessels, eyes, heart, salivary glands, and bone marrow. And from the other things that we looked at in Vata Rakta, that does kind of go along with what we see in Vata Rakta. So rheumatoid arthritis is very much the condition, or a fairly good correlation for Vata Rakta. But it's not the only one. Okay, it's not just Vata Rakta. And this is kind of the argument that tends to happen between North Indian doctors and South Indian doctors. In fact, if you open up any one of these textbooks and you go to the Vata Rakta chapter, they'll write Vata Rakta gout. In the classical text, the English translations, they haven't put in rheumatoid arthritis. They consider it as gout because of, again, some of the signs and symptoms of gout also fall under the realm of Vata Rakta. So both of these actually can be considered as Vata Rakta, not just one. Okay. So you have abnormal physical weakness and lack of energy. You tend to find that actually more with gout than with rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis, it tends to happen, but it may not necessarily always have this issue. Some fatigue, but not very significant. In gout, it tends to be more than, because gout usually can be associated again with psychological issues, tends to be associated sometimes with depression. So you find this particular symptom more with gout than with rheumatoid arthritis. But it's, again, still there in Vata Rakta.
And the physical weakness and lack of energy is during an episode of gout, but not otherwise.
Yeah. That's the thing about gout. Gout has episodes, which indicates the frequent appearance and disappearance, whereas rheumatoid arthritis tends to be more constant. And that's not to say that that's also not there in Vata Rakta. In later stages of Vata Rakta, you do get that as well, where it's more constant and it's not appearing and disappearing. Remember when we talked about stages of the pathogenesis? In the earlier stages where it's not so strong, it's waiting for external trigger factors so it manifests. And when you get other trigger factors that actually work against the disease, it regresses. So that's the stage where you get this appearing and disappearing, or you get this episodes of this condition. You see the episodes, like for instance, Gerard had described it as beer and cheese, beer and cheese. You drink beer and cheese and that becomes the trigger factor, so it shows up and you get an episode of gout, and then after that it goes away again. So partially you can consider this as more of an earlier stage of Vata Rakta, whereas this can be in certain conditions more of a later stage of Vata Rakta. Okay, but they both have symptoms that are described in Vata Rakta. They both can be considered. Okay. This tends to be actually the gout type of Vata Rakta tends to be more in the Kaphaja type. This is much more similar to the Kaphaja type, whereas this is much more similar to the Pitta and Raktaja type. Okay. So that's why you find that things that do actually aggravate kapha or build kapha in the body, they act as trigger factors. That's why people who have gout can't eat mushrooms, because mushrooms actually, they act as trigger factors. And the reason why is because even mushrooms, as described in Ayurveda, does aggravate all doshas, but the reason why it aggravates all doshas is because it induces or increases the kleda in the body. So that's the reason why mushrooms increase the kleda in your body. So that's why mushroom is a trigger factor for gout, and actually it's very similar to the Kaphaja type of gout.
Is that because they grow out of dead things? You know, that's very.
It's a fungus. It thrives and grows in moist climate. In moisture. It needs moisture to grow. So that's why it in itself, it induces more amount of moisture, and not healthy, good moisture, but the thick, slimy, yucky kind.
And mushrooms are glucopolysaccharide, giant molecules that are kind of, ochre-ish. And
Ochre-ish.
they're slimy, clayty.
Yes, slimy and goopy and yucky. Yes. Doesn't mean they don't taste good. I love mushrooms. They do. They taste really good. But they're not really very healthy for you. So yes. And if you have any pre-existing aggravation or tendency of kapha aggravation, then
You're kind of horrible trauma.
oh yeah. Because
But there's so many, there's so much stuff on how good mushrooms are for you, and I definitely know a few people who work through major illnesses using.
Chinese tradition.
Yeah.
But it's not just using the mushroom as it is. Maybe it's
They dry it.
it's processed.
First, usually it's dry and then
Processed.
it again.
It's processed in some way, because the mushroom itself, like plain old regular mushrooms, the different types, if you cook it and eat it, it will have this particular effect. But even as we have seen in all of the medicines that we use, we know that they have very bad effects or they have particular qualities. but we use those qualities to induce a change. So we process them in such a way that it is actually useful for the body. And we kind of take out or ward off or get rid of or purify the unwanted qualities, as you saw with the Google. Okay. So if it's used, if Google, you go and pick it and you take it and use it as such, or you pick it and you powder it and you put it in something and you take it as such, it's not going to be helpful at all. It will aggravate the doshas, it will aggravate pitta, mostly, and produce the side effects. But if you purify it, from our description of purifying, you actually end up reducing that effect and getting now the therapeutic effect. So yes, it can be used. Every substance, if used appropriately, can be a medicine. Okay. So you also find discoloration of skin, appearance of circular patches and lesions, which is right here. So it's sort of a general description that it may affect skin, but you do see this description here in rheumatoid arthritis, and it's very much, remember we were talking about the pathways, about the affecting the external pathway. So here also, there is a slight indication that that this is also accepted as a conventional.
So I just had this kind of, I don't know, it's an aha moment, but when you talk about the circular patches or lesions, a lot of the elderly look like they have these bruises. Is that the same thing?
It's not, it can be. It can definitely be premonitory signs.
Perfectly
Yes.
circular, but there's an odd, texture that's
Yes.
to them.
And if you look at in most elderly, they do have circulatory issues, and they are obviously in the Vata stage of their life. And even if they're not there, our lifestyle is very Vata predominant, so it's very easy for Vata to get aggravated. So yes. So for instance, you do find a lot of people who have these sort of patches. And it's a Purva Rupa of this condition. If it keeps going, if you keep doing, you get these patches, you just ignore it, you do what you usually do, you keep eating what you're eating, doing what you're doing, it's just going to keep progressing, and it's going to keep building and building, and eventually they will end up with that. So that's why we went through these stages. So you have to determine when somebody comes to you, which stage they're at. Are they at the stage of Purva Rupa where it's just a skin condition, or do you see other factors in their diet and lifestyle that is pointing them in the direction of developing Vata? And you will start to see all the other signs and symptoms too. So all those signs and symptoms that we go through, they seem really vague, but when you get a case in front of you, it actually becomes a checklist, and you just start checking off. And I have heard actually a couple of you when we talk, that when you did see the clients after when we discussed it, it did become a checklist. And you did find, oh yeah, this really makes sense. Now I see that. Now I understand why they're having these symptoms. And it becomes more easy for you to ask specific questions, for you to then rule out, is it really this, or is it just an aggravation of the dosha? It's just in a milder form, or is it really this? Okay? Okay, and then here, of course, there'll be inflammation of joints, and you find the inflammation in rheumatoid arthritis, and also you find the inflammation in gout. Okay, so the signs and symptoms of gout, of course, intense joint pain. You find that there's a lingering discomfort, which is again more in the kapha type. Inflammation and redness, very much associated with all of the signs and symptoms of Vata, and limited range of movement. That tends to happen when, again, it's manifesting, or it's localizing in that particular joint. And gout usually does tend to start in the big joint. That's the cardinal sign or symptom or manifestation of gout. Typically, if there's any trigger factor, it'll get aggravated first in the big toe before it aggravates any other joint.
Do we know why? Any idea why it's
Same thing as what we saw. When we described it either as the hands or the toes. But in the classical text, they say it's either one because of the fact that the veins and the capillaries there are very tiny. They're much smaller, and they're more convoluted. So it's very easy for that circulation to get blocked because of the aggravation of Vata, and then the accumulation also of Vata. Okay? So it's very easy for it to occur. In classical text, this is the reason why actually a lot of people associate gout with Vata Rakta because of the fact that gout does first manifest in the big toe. And in the classical text, they mentioned it as feet. But if you look at the Sanskrit term, they have put feet, etc., or feet and they've described because of the tortuous nature of the veins. So in the explanation of a commentary, they said that it's not just the feet, it also applies to the hands. Because the network of veins and capillaries and circulation in the hands and feet are very similar. So it can manifest either first in the hands or the feet. But it's basically looking that in Vata Rakta, it tends to first manifest in the smaller joints of the extremity, hands and feet. Okay? In Amavada, it tends to manifest first in the larger joints, such as the hip and shoulder. In Sandhigata Vata, it's sort of free reign for any joint. Anywhere where there is movement, it can happen anywhere. So whichever joint that person is using more, that's the place where it'll manifest. Okay? So that's again another little bit that you remember.
I had a bout when I was pregnant. And I recall back then that it was, my doctor told me there is pregnancy and induced gout also. My father was still alive at the time. He's a doctor. He put me on the cherries right away. It's like, I just watched the other food that I was eating. But have you heard that before, pregnancy-related gout?
I haven't heard it, but it makes sense. Because in the later stages of pregnancy, there is, because of the actual pressure, it does tend to slow down the circulation to the lower limbs. That's why you tend to have a lot of swelling, sometimes, pain in the knees. I had some very significant swelling on my feet, like in the 8th month and the 9th month, it started to be swelling down my calves and my feet. So after a couple of hours of moving around during the daytime, then I had to come home and put my feet up so it would drain. So that's fairly common. If we look at it in that perspective, it's again a circulation issue and it's again a blocking of Vata issue. In the last trimester of pregnancy, that time Vata does aggravate. That's why you notice in the regimens that have been described for prenatal, the 3rd trimester is all Vata pacifying management. Because we're trying to pacify Vata, because at the time of delivery, Vata is the main dosha responsible for delivery. Apana Vata is what pushes out the fetus, right? That's its main function, one of its main functions. So Vata is naturally going to get aggravated at that time. You don't want Vata aggravated beforehand, before this event happens. So you try to pacify as much Vata before this happens, so that the delivery will be easier as opposed to complicated. But yes, it's very logical why that can happen. Looking for your bout of gout. So Amavata, here also you may find that it can be considered as Amavata. So I'm confusing you a little bit more, but hopefully the first slide would answer this question. Yes, no? You find the symptoms of RA and of gout in Amavata as well. The main difference between the two is this as opposed to this. Okay?
Can you go back one more time? I'm sorry.
This one?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. So you see the signs and symptoms are the same, but there were a couple of things in here that we do find in Amavata as well. The main difference is, so for instance, what I told you in the beginning, if somebody comes in and says, I have rheumatoid arthritis, that still doesn't necessarily mean something yet. It just gives you an idea as to what's happening with them, but you need to know a lot of other stuff. So you use your checklist of Purva Rupa and Rupa of Vata Rakta and Amavata, and you start checking off. Or you make your list of aggravated signs of Rakta, aggravated signs, or signs of Ama, and you start checking off. And that's what's going to be able to tell you the difference between how we need to approach it. Okay? So that's kind of what we're looking for, because here also, weakness and heaviness in the heart, stiffness and pain in the joints, similar sort of areas. It may progress to stiffness in the whole body. That can happen in severe cases of gout. Pain all over the body, loss of taste, sloth and lassitude. You find this here, you find it here as well. Feeling of heaviness, fever. Here you see the fever. This can also be associated with fever. Indigestion, that does tend to happen a lot with gout. Inflammation of various parts of the body. See that in both. So that's why, again, if you go to the textbook and you open up the chapter, under Amavata, it is described as arthritis, because they consider this more similar to that. But again, not necessarily the case. Both of these can come under Amavata as well if there's presence of Ama. If there's no presence of Ama, and if there's more aggravation of Vata Rakta, then it's that one. If there is no Ama, and then if there is Ama and there's not really the factor of Rakta aggravation, then it's this one. So does that make sense now? So this is kind of why we went through all those really tedious details in the beginning, from the Vata Rakta chapter that went on for 4 hours, and then these other two as well, because I want you to get confident in being able to identify these and not necessarily use these terms as your determining factor.
So when something becomes very chronic, then does it always become Vata because the Ama is all eaten up? I thought that after something became so chronic that the Ama even got eaten.
The Ama can get eaten, but then if you get rid of the Ama, it's just this. Because this never really started with too much of issues of Rakta in the first place. The difference is the pathway in which, like, if we really want to get technical to see, like, how do we tell the difference? Remember what we kept repeating again and again? Vata Rakta tends to happen in 2 pathways, whereas Ama Vata actually tends to happen mostly in the middle pathway. Middle and Abhyantara, middle and internal. Because internal Ama and the middle joints. So the difference between Vata Rakta is external and middle, and Ama Vata is middle and internal. A little bit easier? I know, it's a lot of components. But when you start now with all of this, when you start seeing cases, when people come to you with this, you're going to start being able to differentiate. They'll be like little bells in your head. Oh, I see it. It is Ama. Or no, yes, I see it is Rakta. You'll see Vata in both conditions, but you'll be looking for those little bells to go up. Okay? Does that make sense? I know. If it's still confusing, it's okay. It's okay. That's why we have this exercise following this description, so that we'll be able to tell the difference.
I mean, this part seems, all of that seems clear. It's just that whole ringing of when something becomes chronic, that Ama gets eaten up.
The Ama does get eaten up, but what happens when it does get to a chronic state? It doesn't necessarily mean when it gets to a chronic state that Rakta will be involved. When it gets to a chronic state, Vata is involved. And what is common in both of these conditions is Vata is still there. So if this gets to a chronic state, yes, Ama can go, but the Vata will still be there. It then takes over. It starts to present more like Sandhigata Vata, but a severe condition of Sandhigata Vata.
And then you would treat it, though, still like it was Amavata, or you would treat it?
No, you would still treat it as Amavata, but you would treat it at the stage where Ama is gone, and it's just Vata.
Okay. That's perfect.
Yes, and that's why even in your Chikitsa, we have this line of treatment, first to get rid of Ama, and then to pacify Vata. So if Ama isn't there, you skip those steps, and then you go straight to the pacification of Vata.
But you want to assume that Ama can come back easily,
And
because if they haven't changed like patterns of food or all of that, so you still are going to do your, Ahara, Vihara, work, with them,
Right.
no matter what.
Yeah.
Even, just because it got eaten up doesn't mean it's not getting produced.
It may not get produced again, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it still may be getting produced even though it's getting eaten up quickly.
What will happen is, for instance, if you look in the line of treatment, we have the first section of digesting ama, and then we have in preparation of pacifying vata. And in the medicines list, there also, the first part is digesting ama, and next is pacification of vata. So even when ama is completely gone, we still want to make sure that the agni is strong, because everything that we do to pacify vata is all things that are heavy to digest, that are snigdha in nature. So we want to make sure that the agni is strong to be able to handle this kind of medication. So even then also, like Hillary said, we want to make sure that the agni is strong so that there's no more ama produced, as well as whatever we put in, the body can then handle. Because yes, if we look at, there's a long list of things that are good for vata. Doesn't mean that if vata is there, we just throw all of that at the body and it'll just take it and it'll just absorb it. Yeah, you're all good. If that was the case, then everybody could take ashwagandha and they all need it. But it doesn't work that way, because there's a nuance as to how the body then is able to break it down, absorb it, and then start to utilize it for the affected parts. So that process is really important, and the only way that process works is if agni is strong. Otherwise, you can put the best, most ideal medicine in the world, but if the agni isn't strong, it won't be able to do anything. So it's just a waste of medicine.
I don't know if I confused myself, but can Amavata progress the Vata Rakta or vice versa, or am I just lost it?
Not necessarily, but if it depends, yes. Not necessarily, but if the person has enough of what we would say is they're working really hard to produce ama, then yes, it can develop into like a multifaceted condition where they have vata rakta here and they have ama vata here. It can. But that, for the most part, it does tend to show up as just one or the other, or you get vata rakta with all the vata rakta associated signs and symptoms, including skin disorders and all these other.
So it's not necessarily like some
stages.
It's not necessarily that will lead to this or this will lead to that. No, not necessarily.
Separate.
It's just kind of the absence or the presence of more vata or more ama.
No, they're actual separate conditions. They're separate conditions. And then the easy one. This is the easy one. Very simple, straightforward. So, as we had talked about osteoarthritis and osteoporosis, how these are very similar to Sandhigata vata. Sandhigata vata or Asthigata vata. But same pathogenesis, very similar signs and symptoms. Only difference is in this one you're looking for it to manifest more in the joints, and here you're looking for other sort of issues with the bones specifically that's going to be occurring, but same pathogen sort of signs and symptoms that are occurring in the bones. Okay? And most likely if someone is at this particular condition, now you may ask, what do we do if somebody doesn't come and say they have osteoporosis? How do you know if they have osteoporosis? Yes, it would be great if they go to their doctor and their doctor tells them that they have osteoporosis. That's an easy way. If it doesn't happen also, you're still going to be looking for, again, these type of signs and symptoms. You're going to be looking for signs and symptoms of asthikshaya. And that, again, I would suggest you go back and do some homework and look at your notes from your AHC program. Because there, it is there. What happens when asthikshaya occurs? What are the signs and symptoms of decreased asthidhatu, and how you start to feel a pricking sensation, you start to feel like your bones are hollow, you notice, how many people have ever felt like this sort of needles in their heels? That tends to happen a lot when there is asthikshaya occurring. because this is an area where it is supported by muscular tissue, but it is very close. The muscular tissue of the layer isn't as thick compared to over the bone. So when you put a lot of pressure here, you can start to feel it. This is another little trick to figure out if they're on the pathway for osteochia. You start to feel this sort of pain in the heels, which is very similar to getting spurs. How many people have heard of getting spurs in their heels? I've had it. It's painful. It's very hard to walk when you have it. And again, a spur on the heel is nothing but, again, the calcification of the bone. So the diagnostic criteria is great because it kind of just answers the question if the person is osteoporosis. But even before they get diagnosed with osteoporosis, they would have had some of these signs and symptoms showing up of osteochia, okay? Before it gets to the stage where it is a disease that we can name it. Remember? Before it gets to the yucky stage where it becomes a disease and now it is osteoporosis. But before it gets there, there will be all of these accumulation or building of aggravated vata, therefore, and settling into the astidhatu and reducing the astidhatu. Okay? Make sense now? Yeah?
There's a condition, and I think it's called osteogenesis. It's a genetic, where the bones are very brittle, and
In that, are they born with that?
yes, and the people don't grow very tall, they have very pronounced rib cages, but they might suffer from fractures all their life, and there's no known cure. But it's all this vata aggravation, digestion issues because of the compactness of the space. And would one kind of follow this protocol?
They can, but if they're born with it, it increases the severity of the issue, because that means it's a imbalance of doshas that starts from the beginning of their physical life. And their body is already prone from the get-go to having this decrease of astidhatu. So astidhatu, the quality of astidhatu is actually a pitra jabhava, which means it is the quality of our bones is determined by the factors we gain from our father. Okay, so they've described. We were just talking about this the other day about which factors in our body, when our body's being formed in the fetal life, what factors are attributed from your mother and what factors are attributed from your father. And so bones and muscle tissue and sort of what determines if we're big boned or if we have brittle bones or if we have if we're very muscular or lack thereof is something that genetics that we get from our fathers. Okay, so in that case, it can be that. Also, it can be what some of the practices that the mother does at the time of uterine life. If, for instance, there is a high vata type of lifestyle and there is not enough nourishment that would be providing for her astidhatu as well as the formation of healthy astidhatu in the fetus, then yes, that can also be a causative factor for why this happens. Now, those are the causes. Once you get the effect, since the effect started long before the body actually came out into the world, then it's something that we can possibly do some palliative care with, but we can't really ever get rid of that because that becomes very hard. Because the starting point of that itself is way before there was an actual body outside for you to do something. So it's not any external factors that started from the time the baby was born, but the causative factors started before. So that's why those sort of conditions tend to be much stronger in nature. They're born with a vyadi, so it's fairly hard for us to treat that. So we can maybe give things that can help to support them, but we really can't expect too much.
We're 20 after, I had told Rebecca that like 10:30ish, we would do the treatment. She doesn't have a lot of time.
Okay,
obviously.
well, yeah, we're basically done for this session.
Okay.
So, if you guys have questions, we can do that, or we can get started with the.
Yeah, yeah. I'll grab her in a minute, and we could all just take a quick break and prepare for the treatment, and then just have her come in. Do you want to do any diagnosis or any of that with her, or?
Sure. We can just, maybe just
If
feel the
she's
joints.
willing.
Did she say that she has some pain in
Yeah.
her joints? Or?
Yeah, she does. I think they need her.
Okay.
So how do you want to set up?
Well, we want to put her on a chair that's comfortable, so maybe
Maybe-
that one.
Maybe,
Yeah. Sorry, Betty.
Yeah.
The chase. The chase lady.
She has one here. I did notice a massage lady. Would you rather have her on a massage lady?
No, it's better. She just needs to sit comfortably. We might need to put a towel underneath
Okay.
her legs, because that might be, and maybe, it might be a little bit cool. She
Huh?
might feel a little bit cool. We don't want her legs to get cold.
Okay, so we'll do like.
Yeah.
Okay. I will go. So we'll all take a little break.
Oh,
I could go over the leaves here, just put them all in a bowl.
Okay, thank
And
you.
then you have the powder.
I have the powder, we're gonna mix it into food. I just wanna write a couple of things down for the next session.
Should I want me to bring the chair out in the middle or just?
Sure, or she can, if anything, yeah, so cause she's gonna stay there.
We'll just corral around.